So there's the recording. Hi, if you're joining me on YouTube, just as a reminder, I'm always live at 10:30 on Twitch. Um, I've posted a link a million times. If you're having issues accessing it, I know it's different than some of the other things you've done before. Let me know. I'll guide you there so you can participate while I am live, and you're not getting confused by when I stop to address chat, because that could be a little weird. Also, reminder: if you do watch it on recording, that's fine. You can always go back to the chat site and just view what people have commented throughout, so you can kind of have a better understanding of what I'm talking about. And also, if you have any questions on homework, if you have any you need my help, you can always chat there pretty much whenever. I'll try and get back to you as quickly as I can. The designated time is 2 to 4 today on Monday and Wednesday. It's when I'm sitting here ready to answer your questions as fast as I can. But you can ask at any time, and I'll try and respond as soon as I can. I try and keep it open from 8 to 4 on days that we have school, so Monday through Thursday. Anyway, so today we are talking about lesson 4 for this unit, which is the civil rights movement. Now, this is something we've highlighted at various points throughout this entire year, so it should be something that's familiar to you in many ways. But we're going to talk about specifically during the 1950s and 1960s, what took place and what progress was made. So first thing you need to keep in mind, going back to the very first unit we talked about, which was Reconstruction. Many different things were put in place to kind of limit the freedoms of the newly freed slaves, African Americans, especially in the South. But just because it was happening in the South doesn't mean it wasn't also happening in the North. You should keep that in mind as well. There's discrimination going on throughout the country, but a big focus on it was in the South. It had limited the lives of millions of Americans in a variety of different ways. We've highlighted many of these before, but you should be familiar with how this was implemented. They enforced segregation of races in schools, theaters, restaurants, and other public places, basically restricting their rights to go in and participate fully with white people. They had to have their own separate facilities. They had to have their own separate schools. You can go on, and we'll if you remember what court case that was that implemented that separate but equal, be very, very impressed. We'll talk about it in just a little bit. Yes, we'll get to Jackie Robinson. We have a video on him, Hayden. But during World War II, we had NAACP membership growing from 50,000 to 500,000. We remember last unit we talked about the double V campaign, so earning victory in the war as well as victory at home against discrimination. African Americans had put this into place, and you could see that's one of the big ways that was successful, raising the membership of the NAACP tenfold, multiplying it by 10. It was very, very successful, and now they had a full force ready to go. Melissa says, Plessy v. Ferguson, well done. I don't have candy for you, but if I did, you would get some. Very impressive. Or you looked it up. Either way, well done. Jackie Robinson, as we were talking, I just mentioned, he was one of the early figures in this civil rights movement as well. Gage, Plessy v. Ferguson, little slow on the draw there, but still really well done. If you get awesome, I'm glad you guys remember that. Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball in 1947. So he becomes one of these early public figures as part of this movement. So 1947, just a few years after World War II, he starts playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Well done, Hayden, on knowing that. And kind of becomes this center of attention and a lot of this hatred from many who do not wish to see segregation end. He pushes these barriers, and of course, it takes a lot of courage from him to stand up against this onslaught of hatred, because as he becomes more and more involved and more of a public figure, he receives more hate for it. We'll watch a short video on it, so I'll cut it short there, but you'll see some of those struggles. Thurgood Marshall, um, a lawyer at the time, he also took to the courts to try and battle this segregation. Now we talked about Plessy v. Ferguson. We'll get back to that, but he starts to try and use the legal system to break down these barriers. And you have President Truman, of course. We've talked about this, but ordering the integration of the armed forces in 1948, finally starting to, become more and more united. All right, continuing on. We do have a short video, so I'll mute my mic. If you have any questions, put it in the chat. Otherwise, we're just going to watch this. If you are somebody who watches a lot of ESPN, you might recognize a few figures in here. I thought that was kind of neat. But anyway.
Born January 31st, 1919, in Cairo, Georgia, Jack Roosevelt Robinson was the youngest of 5 siblings. He followed his older brother Mac into athletics.
Mac went off and he competed in the 1936 Olympics. This is an athlete who had won a medal under the eye of Adolf Hitler. He came back to Pasadena, and Mac Robinson could only find work as a garbage man. That's something that Jackie Robinson never forget.
Robinson was a star athlete at Pasadena Junior College and became the first UCLA student to win varsity letters in 4 sports: basketball, football, track, and baseball.
He was a local tennis champion. He was a local football stud. He was a great track star. Well, Jackie Robinson, baseball was really almost the last thing he was great at. He was great at everything. He could have done anything.
While in the Army, Robinson was arrested for refusing to move to the back of a segregated bus. Robinson fought a court-martial and was eventually given an honorable discharge.
Jackie Robinson was sick and tired of the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army felt that they had a problem on their hands with Lieutenant Robinson, so they agreed that he would be honorably discharged.
With the Negro Leagues as his only opportunity to play professional baseball, Robinson joined the Kansas City Monarchs in 1945. That same year, he was given a life-changing invitation by Branch Rickey of the Brooklyn Dodgers.
There were players in the Negro League that were just as good, if not better, than Jackie Robinson. But Branch Rickey understood that he needed more than just a superb baseball player. He needed someone who had flawless and impeccable character, and he found that person in Jackie Robinson.
Despite harsh opposition, Robinson was selected as the first Rookie of the Year, became the first man in the league in 26 years to steal his way around the bases, and in 1955, he helped the Brooklyn Dodgers win the World Series against the New York Yankees.
The valor with which Jackie Robinson responded to the jeers and the hatred and the bigoted remarks in the catcalls is one of the great silent portraits in American history. Under that hail of threats and epithets, he would walk into the batter's box. And about a little over the third of the time, because I believe he batted a 330-something that year, he'd get a hit. That's what he did. He certainly didn't cower. He certainly didn't flinch, and there were a lot of beanballs thrown at him.
Jackie Robinson wasn't just a great symbol, he was a great baseball player. He led the Brooklyn Dodgers to 6 pennants when he was there. And this is a Brooklyn Dodger team that was called the Bums, because they couldn't win. Jackie Robinson led them, and part of it was his fire. His fire kept them going.
Shortly after being traded to the New York Giants, Robinson retired from baseball in 1957 and became a business executive.
After Jackie Robinson left baseball, his fight wasn't over. I mean, he continued to fight for civil rights. He was a member of the NAACP's upper management, campaigned for them, campaigned with Dr. King to try and integrate a lot of America. Also, opened up a bank in Harlem. I mean, this was a guy who this meant more to him than just his legacy as a baseball player.
He was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1962 and later died from a heart attack on October 24, 1972. In 2005, Jackie Robinson was honored with the Congressional Gold Medal.
The story of Jackie Robinson changed the literal complexion of the game. It changed the complexion of images that we saw in black and white photos in newspapers and on television. It put a black man at the center of the story of America. And I think we've been an imperfect but infinitely better society ever since.
All right, so there you go. I thought that was really interesting. Percy has decided to join us, so there you go. Oh. All right, so we're going to take a look at some big court cases throughout this time, and we'll take a look at a few of them. Really, just the first one, a little bit closer. But these court cases were very instrumental into um, ending the segregation in many different areas, because they had to basically break it down piece by piece. It wasn't a simple matter of, okay, well, snap our fingers and segregation's over in all these different areas. We really had to break it down and get, first of all, Brown versus Board of Education, probably the most famous of all of these cases. So ending racial segregation in public schools. So basically reversing that ruling of Plessy v. Ferguson, as we talked about. You have Hernandez v. Texas, which said that discrimination based on class is not constitutional or violates the 14th Amendment. You have Boynton versus Virginia, so ending segregation on buses. Heart of Atlanta Motel refusing to rent rooms to African Americans violates Civil Rights Act of 1964, and Loving v. Virginia, which basically ended the ban on interracial marriage. So just becoming more and more modern throughout these times, and ending the different bits of the segregation laws that were still in place. So as we talked about, in 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson establishes the legal precedent of separate but equal. And what was interesting was that in many of these court cases that we highlighted, and others that we didn't talk about specifically, but they challenged not that separate but equal was a bad thing, but the fact that in almost every single case, separate never actually meant equal. So in Brown v. Board of Education, it reached the U.S. Supreme Court, and they ruled in Brown's favor, beginning the desegregation of schools. So basically, the whole situation there was Brown's daughter wanted to go to a all-white school that was just a few blocks away from the house, instead of having to be bused basically across town to go to a black school. And obviously that he challenged the fact that it was not legal for her to go to the school that was nearby. It ends up going all the way to the Supreme Court, and they decide to rule that, you know what, yeah, separate but equal is not really working out here in every measurable way. Um, these African American schools were doing worse than all white schools in terms of overall retention, reading rates, scores. All you could go down the list. Every single one. The facilities were run down. They were not well kept. It was bad. They were not getting equal treatment at all. And as Chief Justice Earl Warren said, we conclude that in field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are always unequal. There you go. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Little Rock Nine here. So, in Arkansas, it was taking them quite a while to start to reintegrate many of their schools. And the reason is because the order that was given out after Brown v. Board of Education was that the states had to reintegrate their schools it basically was like a reasonable time. They didn't give them a specific amount. They said they need to be doing it quickly. And a lot of governors took that to mean, well, we'll get around to it eventually, especially in the South. They had no rush to get to reintegrate the schools, and some of them took years before they were finally really starting to do so. And one of these areas that was highlighted was the Little Rock Nine. So you had this central high school in Little Rock where these 9 African American students were going to start going almost as like a test run to get in there and have a small presence before it kind of ramps up to full complete reintegration. and they became known as the Little Rock Nine. So what ends up happening is that the Arkansas governor decides, well, we don't want we don't want to end segregation here. We want to try and keep the integrity of our school. So he calls in basically the guard to prevent these students from entering into the school at all. Basically calling in armed guards to prevent them from entering in. And of course, the President Eisenhower sees this and is upset. He's going directly against the order, so he calls in the military to escort them in to the school, and becomes obviously this huge national scene. And all of these pictures of them going into school become extremely widespread. Probably none more so than this one right here. You can see just the hatred and the mockery and the uneasy glances coming from many. You could see armed soldiers in the background, and as this becomes this huge, huge event, there's actually a lot of backstory behind this picture, and these two ladies have since met and reconciled differences. But it becomes this big picture of how there are still many in America who are just passionately against um, the desegregation of schools. And eventually, they have to be walked in, and they are mistreated. Things are thrown at them. Stuff is stuffed into their lockers. It is horrible, but they still soldier through. We watched that in video to open this topic, 2 weeks ago. But they continue fighting on, continue going to class as best they can, and then eventually, it's the tensions die down. They're no longer the national story, and things start to become a new normal. But it's a long, long process, and there are many different avenues in which this battle for civil rights is fought. Um, Another famous one, you have the Montgomery bus boycott, which all started with Rosa Parks. So on Friday, December 2nd, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, so that a white man could have her seat. As you probably know, at the time, the back of the bus was reserved for colored people, and the front was reserved for white people, as the sign said. So anytime that a white person, whether man or woman, wanted a seat in the front, they basically could pick any black people who were sitting there to the back of the bus where they were forced to sit, which obviously was the conditions were not as good, anywhere near as good. So she refused to give up her seat, and it was arrested and thrown in jail simply for not giving up her seat for a white man. And obviously this causes quite a commotion, and the NAACP activists start to meet to discuss how are they going to be able to respond to this new injustice. How are they going to be able to address this in a way that is impactful, because this clearly needs to stop. And of course, part of this meeting. You had Martin Luther King Jr. there, the the famous civil activist, and he gives this still famous speech there at this meeting. My friends, there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. We are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Obviously quite an inspiring leader. And with him kind of as this figure that people can look to, they begin to implement a bus boycott in the city that continues to last for over a year. So starting that Monday, they told everybody, do not use the buses. We cannot allow this behavior from the government to allow this discrimination to continue and these unfair imprisonments. So we are just going to not use the bus, and we're going to make the city feel that pain, because the city is going to profits off of bus fees. And it goes back and any profits they make go back to the city. So we're going to make sure that they don't get those don't get as significant of profits by refusing to use it. So obviously it creates a lot of problems for some people, for those who are participating and need to get across town. So they start to organize these systems where they could get lifts from people with cars from a different part of the from one part of the city to the other. Other people walk long distances each day to work or to wherever they need to go. But it starts to work, and it starts to the city starts to feel the pain, the financial issues from this boycott. And MLK continues to be an advocate for civil rights, now spreading continued across the South. But he insists that his followers, those who listen to him, that the gatherings that he organizes, limit their actions to what is known as civil disobedience, or basically it's nonviolent protest against unjust laws. You'll probably talk more about civil disobedience in the future when you're in high school. But civil disobedience, it boils down to refusing to follow laws that you do not believe are that you don't believe are just. They are not something that you do not believe are laws that make sense, that are just, that are not fair. So he starts to encourage this among his the groups that he leads, and it kind of it continues to work in many areas. This bus boycott eventually does help make a difference, and they start to put in different laws to prevent this kind of discrimination, and it works in many other ways as well. So, continuing protests, we're going to take a look at some other ways that MLK and other civil rights activists were able to make difference. One of these ways was these sit-ins. So basically, they would go to, like in this picture, a diner where these certain seats at this location were reserved for white customers only. So they were the wait staff would refuse to serve them. So they would be like, well, okay, well, we're just going to sit here until you serve us. This obviously had many different purposes. This, number one, for the restaurant, now they're starting to lose customers. They're not going to be, if they're not serving these people, then, and they're refusing to move, well, they can't exactly operate as well as they can. It creates a lot of eyeballs are drawn to these big issues, and it's like, well, what are we supposed to do? How can we really get them in trouble for sitting down in a restaurant and wanting to order food? Right? It creates a bad image if you start to try and drag people out, but they did. Dakota says the chat thing happened again. Yeah, I don't know why. Whatever. I just switched it up. If you want to be somebody who spams in chat, you might need to just follow me. I might just change it to, if you have to be following me for a few weeks, and I'll let you spam stuff. But right now, I've switched it to 3 months followers only because I was tired of random people stumbling across this and spamming nonsense. Whatever. Anyway, so in many locations, the police or people who are, or other white people who supported segregation would respond using a lot of force. So sometimes they would respond using attack dogs, water hoses. Houses and churches of black leaders were bombed as well by many of those who were violently against desegregation. It becomes a huge issue, and the focus of much of the attention across the United States. And it continues until 1963, where you have the famous march on Washington, D.C., where more than 200,000 Americans marched trying to get Congress to pass laws to end discrimination. And that's where MLK gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. I chose just a little part of this, the close to the end. It's really impactful, in my opinion. But when we let freedom ring, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jew and Gentile, Protestant and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Um, and shortly after this march, the opinions of many Americans start to really change. They start to gain more and more sympathy towards these civil rights activists, and you can understand why. With these violent countermeasures to many of their peaceful protests, they gain more and more sympathy, and eventually you see President Johnson, President Lyndon B. Johnson, able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which now protects the right of all citizens to vote and outlaws discrimination in hiring and ends segregation of public places. So finally, being part of the laws, you can see that starting to, starting to become more and more integrated, more and more normal. And to this day, that's still a fight that is, undergoing. It's obviously the everybody understands the legal side of it now that it's a law, but that doesn't mean that discrimination is completely over even to this day. And it's our job as citizens to try and keep that in mind, the way we treat people who are different than us in all different aspects. Um, let's talk about Malcolm X just real quick. Um, so he was another civil rights leader who kind of advocated for more um, active means of protesting, about fighting back a little bit more impactfully than MLK did. MLK was all about civil disobedience and not antagonizing or not using violence. Malcolm X wanted a little bit more separation. He wanted to create, he wanted to lead a rise to more of the Black Power movement and having them almost be still separate, but just as powerful. So and he ends up getting assassinated because of his views as well. And shortly after the Civil Rights Act, we have a confrontation in Los Angeles between a white police officer and an African American man, leads to a riot where 4,000 people are arrested, 34 were killed, and leads to riots across the United States in many different areas. And then eventually, and in 1968, you have Martin Luther King Jr. continuing to preach nonviolence. He comes to Memphis to help support a strike that is going on there. And when he steps outside his motel room where he was staying, he is killed by a white gunman, was assassinated in 1968. About 20 years later, or I think it was 18 years later, eventually we implement a national holiday to remember him, MLK Day. You all know that we get that day off in January, but so it kind of shows a few different things. Number one, progress had been made, but that doesn't mean that issues were over. They were continuing on even to this day. As I said, um, MLK was assassinated because he fought for equal rights and he was hated for it. None of this was easy, and he knew that he was going to be in danger at some point. That it was just a matter of time before somebody used their hatred to do this. It shows that hatred is a thing that needs to be um, watched. You should not ever harbor hatred in your heart for anybody. I know there are people out there that we consider enemies of the United States, or people out there that have done horrible things, but you need to keep in mind that we have been called to share God's love, and what God's love shows to those who even may hate us is that we do not you know we don't reciprocate that. We do not hate other people. We can dislike and condemn the actions of some. We could say that obviously doing different things is terrible, but you should not let hatred into your heart, and any grievances you have against others, you need to work on finding a way to forgive them. Hopefully, you still don't feel that way towards anybody, any classmates or anybody that maybe is outside of that. You need to work on forgiveness because it's an important thing. Even if somebody has rightfully done something wrong against you and you're upset, make sure you work on forgiveness because that's something that we as a country and as a world need to work on. What are affirmative action programs, says Shamir? Funny you ask. Let's talk about that. All right. This is the last slide. So before we get to this last slide, I'm going to tell you the answer to the secret question on our assignment. It's live right now. You could go down to question 5. I believe I said this is question 5 is the title of it. Question 5 is you must spell your history teacher's last name. Tough one, right? Make sure you spell it. If you don't spell it correctly, you will not get credit. It is capital SALAMON. That's my last name, Salamone. So there you go. Obviously, it's in my Twitch channel name and all that kind of stuff. It's just making sure you are watching this. Did we talk about the affirmative action programs? We're about to, Gage. That's this last slide that we're on. Again, I'm trying to keep it short, trying to keep these between 30 and 45 minutes at the most. So here we go. Unemployment by race by 1950 and 1970. In the chat right now, I want you to kind of, what do you notice about this? What do you notice about this graph? You can see black and white as it continues throughout from 1950 to 1970. What do you notice? I'll wait for a little bit. See what you guys can say. I know there are many people in the chat. What's the subtitle for this slide? There really isn't one. You could just put it back for civil rights progress. That's totally fine. Black and white are mirrored, says Matthew. Anything else? Anybody else want to add in there? They peaked at the same time. Okay. Good. You're starting to notice something. You're starting to get it here, Evan. Well done. What you should notice is that the gap between them is pretty consistent. If there was no discrimination and everything was all equal, they should be, about at the same point, or maybe even crossing over. But this gap remains throughout. Mary says most employment was in 1958. Absolutely, just the same. Black is at a higher percent. Okay, good. You're noticing that they're staying pretty consistently. There's this gap between. They don't close. You'd think if discrimination was over, you know what? The unemployment gap should get closer and closer together. Noah says peaked at 1958. Thank you, Noah. But what you really should that's why I'm saying you should take away is that there's this gap and it doesn't get really much closer even as we progress. So in order to try and counteract this effect, they start to put many businesses and universities adopt affirmative action programs, basically programs that incentivize businesses and colleges to accept more Black students or Black workers into their programs. They seek to hire and promote more minorities and women. That's basically what this is in many different ways. There are different ways that different job fields or businesses trying to implement this. One of the most famous ones is in the NFL. That's the Rooney Rule. If you are ever hiring like a new coach, you are required to interview at least one minority for that position. That is a legal requirement. So many different industries have to ensure that they are hiring at a closer to equal rate. Now, obviously, it's not going to be exactly equal. They can't do that because there are far, far more white people in America still to this day than African Americans. But it's something that they've been working on closing the gap going forward. So it's something to keep in mind, and that's, I believe, part of your homework. All right, so I believe we're going to call it there. This first homework that you have for this week is pretty short, obviously. It's multiple choice including the one secret question. Glad you guys were here and you were able to get that, whether it's now or whether you're watching it on YouTube. Spend the next 20 minutes at most. Honestly, it shouldn't take that long to get this done. As soon as I'm no longer live, you can watch the past broadcasts on Twitch. So if you're live right now and you're like, well, I missed one of these slides, I missed some of the notes, I can go back and check that. Oh, what did Mr. Salamone say about this question? Go back. If you have any questions for me, send them in this chat, or you can send them on Google Classroom. Either way, I'll try and respond to them as best we can. Shabir, in America, you have all kinds of races and ethnicities, but in Pakistan, only Pakistanis. Well, America, as we talked about before, has, especially in the 1800s, really welcomed a lot of different immigrants coming from all over, and it's still supposed to be one of our tenets today, where we accept people from across the world. What did I say about number 4? Let me double check, William. Did I not address that directly? How did Rosa Parks' actions redirect the tactics of the civil rights movement? Okay, so let's go back to that real quick, because you're right. I didn't explicitly say some stuff like this. But it's Montgomery bus boycott in many different ways. It starts to it begins this mass change of across the South and across the United States, where this direct action, this active participation in these boycotts were able to make a big difference to create this political change. So whether it's in the South in Montgomery or across the nation in other ways, this begins a more and more of a movement for civil rights and equality in many different ways. So yeah, that's basically what we're talking about here. This mass movement inspiring political change. All right, can I go back to the affirmative action slide? Yes. All right. I'm going to stop the recording here for YouTube. If you have any questions, let me know.